Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, maybe to an article, some research notes you've seen, and we really dig in to find the core insights. Think of it as getting you up to speed quickly, but with the interesting bits included. And today, we're diving into something that, well, it touched almost everyone's lives, COVID-19, but maybe in ways you haven't fully considered. Yeah, our source today is a pretty hefty review article from Nature Medicine. It pulls together a lot of clinical papers, scientific studies, mainly from the early phase of the pandemic.
That's right. And the main point, really, is that while everyone knows COVID hits the lungs hard, this source makes it crystal clear that the virus goes way beyond that. It affects lots of other organs and systems. So our goal here is to unpack these extrapulmonary manifestations, that's the technical term, but basically, how does the virus get outside the lungs and what does it do when it gets there? And these aren't just, theories. The source is based on what doctors and researchers were actually seeing on the ground in hospitals, especially early on. So it's a detailed look at the sometimes shocking range of effects they observe.
It really is fascinating because, initially it felt like maybe just a bad respiratory bug, but the picture that emerged, and pretty quickly too, was so much more complex, system after system getting involved. So let's unpack this together. Let's explore just how wide-ranging this virus's impact on the body really was. Okay, let's kick off with the fundamentals. How does SARS-CoV-2 actually get into our cells?
Right. The basic mechanism. It uses that famous spike protein. Think of it like a key. And it fits into a specific lock on our cells, a receptor called ACE2.
ACE2.
Yeah. And sometimes another enzyme, TMPRSS2, kind of helps it open the door. The source points out that how well that key fits the lock, the binding efficiency, that's a big reason why it spreads so easily.
Okay, so that's how it gets in. But how does it get beyond the lungs?
Well, here's the crucial bit. That ACE2 receptor, the lock, it's not just in the lungs. Turns out it's actually found in quite a few other tissues, heart, kidneys, the gut lining, even the brain.
Ah, okay, so the lock is everywhere.
Pretty much. And that immediately told researchers, look, if the virus uses ACE2 to get in, and ACE2 is in these other places, then theoretically the virus could cause problems there too. And what's interesting, even from these early papers, is they realized it probably wasn't just one single thing causing all the damage in these other organs. They proposed several different ways this could happen.
Multiple mechanisms working together.
Potentially, yes. Or maybe different mechanisms being more important in different people or different organs. The source lists a few key possibilities. First, the most straightforward idea, direct viral toxicity. The virus gets into the cells in the heart or kidney or wherever and just directly damages or kills them.
Makes sense. If it can get in, it can cause trouble.
Exactly. And finding ACE2 there, plus sometimes seeing actual bits of virus in tissue samples under the microscope, that supported this idea. But second, and this turned out to be a huge factor, endothelial cell damage and thromboinflammation.
Okay, break that down. Endothelial cells.
They're the super thin cells that line the inside of all our blood vessels, every single one, from the biggest artery to the tiniest capillary. And guess what? They have ACE2 receptors too.
Ah, so the virus can attack the blood vessel lining itself.
Right. Or the immune system's reaction to the virus damages that lining. And when the endothelium gets damaged and inflamed, it's bad news. It makes the inside of the vessels rough and sticky instead of smooth.
Leading to
Clots. The source talks about a prothrombotic state. The blood just becomes much more likely to form clots. They saw evidence of this everywhere. Inflammation in the vessel walls, tiny clots called microthrombi, especially in small vessels. It's like a system-wide attack on the vascular plumbing.
Wow, okay, so direct damage plus messing up the blood vessels. What else?
Third, the body's own immune response going off the rails. This is the dysregulation of the immune response, sometimes called a cytokine storm.
Right, I've heard that term. The body overreacting.
Exactly. The immune system gets triggered, but instead of a controlled defense, it's like sending in the entire army with heavy artillery for a minor skirmish. The source mentions overactivation of the initial responders, the innate immune system, and also problems with T cells, which are crucial for coordinating the response.
And how do they see this happening?
They saw sky-high levels of inflammatory markers in patients' blood. Things like C-reactive protein, ferritin, IL-6, D-dimer. These were often way up. And importantly, how high these markers were often predicted how sick the patient would get. It wasn't just a side effect, it was driving the severity.
Okay, so that's three. Was there a fourth?
Yes, a potentially important one involving a system called RAAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system.
Right. That controls blood pressure, fluid balance.
Exactly. And ACE2, our virus receptor, it's actually a key part of that system. Normally, it helps keep things in balance by breaking down a substance called angiotensin II, which constricts blood vessels and promotes inflammation.
So if the virus binds to ACE2,
It might basically disable that enzyme or at least reduce its activity, so you lose that balancing effect. Angiotensin II levels might go up, leading to more inflammation, more vessel constriction, potentially contributing to tissue injury in places like the heart and kidneys.
okay, wow. So it's potentially the virus itself, plus damaged blood vessels leading to clots, plus an out-of-control immune response, and maybe messing with the body's fundamental blood pressure regulation system.
Precisely. It's likely a combination of these things interacting in complex ways that leads to all the different problems seen outside the lungs.
That paints a much clearer and frankly scarier picture.
Yeah.
So let's dive into how this actually looked in patients. What did the source say about specific organ systems? Maybe start with the blood and that clotting issue you mentioned.
Right, the hematologic side. Well, besides common things like low lymphocyte counts, lymphopenia, which did correlate with worse outcomes, the really striking feature was this intense clotting tendency. They termed it COVID-19 associated coagulopathy. And it wasn't just abnormal lab tests, though those were their really high D-dimer and fibrinogen levels, which were strongly linked to mortality.
So the lab tests were showing a major clotting problem. Did that translate into actual clots?
Oh, absolutely. Alarmingly high rates of thrombotic complications. DVTs, deep vein thrombosis, clots in the legs and PEs, pulmonary embolisms, clots in the lungs. The source cites studies finding these in up to 30% of ICU patients.
30%, even with standard prevention.
Even with standard anticoagulation prophylaxis, yeah. And some studies during routine screening found even higher rates. They also saw clots on the arterial side causing heart attacks, strokes, loss of blood flow to limbs.
And you mentioned microclots earlier.
Yes, that was a key finding from autopsies. These tiny clots, microthromby, particularly clogging up the small capillaries in the lungs, were found way more often in COVID-19 deaths compared to deaths from severe flu, 9 times more common in one comparison.
9 times.
That's tough.
That really emphasizes how different this was.
It really does. It points back to that combination of severe inflammation and that widespread endothelial damage, creating this incredibly pro-clotting environment.
So how did they approach managing this huge clotting risk?
Well, the source recommended really close monitoring of those clotting markers, D-dimers, fibrinogen, and blood counts. There was a lot of debate, and the paper discusses considering higher doses of blood thinners, more therapeutic anticoagulation, in some severe cases, given the high risk, even if a clot wasn't confirmed yet.
Using stronger treatment proactively.
In some situations, yes, though the evidence was still evolving fast at that time. Injectable anticoagulants like heparin were often preferred in hospital settings.
Okay, let's move to the heart and cardiovascular system. Obviously, clots could cause heart attacks, but what else was happening to the heart?
A lot, unfortunately. Myocardial injury damage to the heart muscle itself was very common. They detected it using blood tests for cardiac markers like troponin.
Troponin, right. That means heart muscle cells are stressed or dying.
Exactly. And this was seen in maybe 20–30% of hospitalized patients, even higher in those who already had heart disease. And again, it was strongly linked to severity and worse outcomes.
What was causing that heart damage? Was it the virus directly attacking the heart muscle?
That was definitely on the table as a possibility. Heart muscle cells do have ACE2 receptors, but it could also be myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, maybe triggered by the virus or the immune response.
Or just the overall stress?
Yes. Or the cytokine storm itself causing damage, or lack of oxygen from lung problems, or even those microclots affecting the heart's own blood supply. It was likely multifactorial. The source also mentions other cardiac issues showing up, like new arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats, or cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle weakens.
What about patients already on heart meds, like ACE inhibitors or ARBs? There was worry early on that those might be bad, right?
Yeah.
Because of the ACE2 connection.
Yes, huge confusion initially. But the consensus reported in the source, based on the data available then, was clear. Do not stop these medications. There wasn't evidence they were harmful. And some hints suggested they might even be slightly protective, though more research was needed.
So keep taking your regular heart meds.
That was the recommendation. Management otherwise focused on careful monitoring, being cautious with drugs that could affect heart rhythm, especially since some COVID treatments being tried had that side effect.
Okay, let's talk kidneys. Were they spared?
Unfortunately, no. Acute kidney injury, AKI, was another really common and serious complication, especially in the critically ill. Some studies cited in the source showed AKI in like 78% to even 90% of ICU patients.
90%, that's staggering. Needing dialysis.
Yeah, a significant number required dialysis, maybe around 14% in one large New York City cohort, often because the kidney injury was severe or because managing fluids became incredibly difficult with both lung and kidney failure. They also frequently saw blood and protein in the urine, which also signaled worse outcomes.
Why are the kidneys taking such a hit? Same reasons as the heart.
Pretty much the same suspects. Direct viral infection was possible, kidney cells have ACE2, and viral particles were seen in biopsies. Damage to the kidney's delicate blood vessels from the clotting and inflammation was likely a major factor. And just the overall systemic chaos of the cytokine storm, low oxygen, sometimes low blood pressure from shock puts immense stress on the kidneys.
Any specific kidney mechanisms?
Interestingly, yes. The source mentions a possible link in some patients, particularly those with African ancestry carrying specific APOL1 gene variants, to a very severe form of kidney disease called collapsing FSGS. It's like the virus triggered this specific pathway in genetically susceptible individuals.
That's fascinating. Managing kidney failure on top of everything else must have been incredibly challenging.
Extremely. Fluid balance was a nightmare. Too little volume hurts the kidneys, too much volume floods the lungs and heart. And the source highlights that clotting issue. Again, dialysis circuits were apparently clotting off frequently, requiring careful anticoagulation strategies.
Okay, how about the digestive system?
Gut and liver.
Yeah, were GI symptoms common?
Very. Things like loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. The source notes these occurred in anywhere from 12% to over 60% of patients in different studies, sometimes even without respiratory symptoms.
And the liver.
Liver enzyme elevations indicating liver injury were also seen frequently, especially in sicker patients, and again associated with severity.
Mechanisms there. Similar story.
Plausible direct viral damage, yes. Gut lining cells and bile duct cells in the liver have ACE2. They also noted high levels of viral RNA shed in stool for prolonged periods, though transmission risk via that route wasn't fully pinned down. Liver issues could also stem from the cytokine storm, low oxygen, or drug side effects.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, what about the endocrine system, hormones, metabolism? Diabetes came up early as a big risk factor. Right?
Absolutely. Patients with pre-existing diabetes and also obesity were clearly at much higher risk for severe COVID-19. That was one of the earliest strong signals.
But did COVID itself cause endocrine problems?
It seemed to, yes. Even patients without known diabetes were showing up with really high blood sugar, hyperglycemia. Some even developed diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, a serious complication.
Why would that happen?
Well, the massive inflammation from the cytokine storm can directly impair insulin production or make the body resistant to the insulin it does produce. The source also mentions reports, though maybe inconsistent, of ACE2 receptors on the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. So, a direct viral hit on the pancreas was considered a possibility.
And obesity being a risk factor.
Obesity itself is a pro-inflammatory state, so it likely primed the immune system to overreact even more strongly to the virus, worsening that cytokine storm.
Let's cover the brain and nerves. Neurologic symptoms were reported too, weren't they?
They were. The source mentions one study finding them in about 36% of a severe cohort. Common things were milder headache, dizziness, fatigue, muscle aches, and of course the famous loss of smell, anosmia, and taste, ageusia.
Any idea why the smell and taste went?
The thinking mentioned in the source relates it back to ACE2 again. Apparently, cells in the nasal lining near the olfactory bulb that processes smell have high levels of ACE2. So direct viral impact right there seems likely.
What about more serious brain issues?
Sadly, yes. Stroke was reported in up to 6% of severe cases in one study. Also confusion, delirium, impaired consciousness, and rare but devastating things like Guillain-Barré syndrome, or even direct inflammation or damage to brain tissue itself, like encephalitis.
And the eyes.
Conjunctivitis, basically pink eye, was noted as a possible manifestation as well.
How was the virus getting to the brain or causing these problems?
Coronaviruses in general do have some neuroinvasive potential, so direct entry, perhaps via the nose and olfactory nerve, is possible. But for many of the severe issues like stroke and confusion, the systemic problems were likely the main driver. The cytokine storm, the widespread clotting affecting brain blood vessels, maybe breakdown of the blood-brain barrier.
Right, the whole body chaos affecting the brain.
Exactly.
Last system, the skin. Anything happening there?
Yep. Dermatologic issues were reported too, maybe in around 20% in one Italian study. It was a real mix of things. Some people got fairly standard rashes, hives, or even chickenpox-like blisters.
But there were some more specific things too, right? Like COVID toes.
Yes, those acrocutaneous lesions often looking like chilblains or punio on the toes or fingers, red, swollen, sometimes painful. Interestingly, the source notes these were often seen in patients with less severe overall illness, frequently younger people.
Huh. Any idea why?
The pathophysiology wasn't totally clear. Could be immune reactions, maybe tiny clots in the skin's microvasculature, or inflammation of those small vessels, vasculitis. They also saw other rashes in severe cases like livedoid patterns suggesting poor blood flow, or petechiae, tiny bleeding spots, possibly linked to low platelets or clotting issues. Ruling out drug reactions was also important.
Okay, so that covers the main organ systems in adults. Did the source look at any specific groups, like kids or pregnant women?
It did. For children, the early data consistently showed much milder disease overall compared to adults. Fewer cases, fewer hospitalizations, very few needing ICU care initially.
But then came MISC.
Exactly. Multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. This was a crucial later observation. It's a severe shock-like inflammatory condition hitting multiple organs, often weeks after the child had a mild or even asymptomatic COVID infection. It resembles Kawasaki disease.
So it's a post-infection immune problem.
That's the thinking. The acute illness might be mild, maybe because of differences in kids' immune systems or ACE2 receptors, but then this delayed, exaggerated immune response kicks in. Managing MISC involved anti-inflammatory treatments like IVIG and steroids, and often anticoagulation.
And pregnant women.
Early data suggested their susceptibility and the severity of their illness were generally similar to non-pregnant adults of the same age. Not dramatically higher rates of severe complications overall, although some studies hinted at increased risks for things like preterm birth or C-sections.
Was vertical transmission, mother to baby, a big concern?
It seemed possible but likely uncommon based on the early reports reviewed in the source. Management during pregnancy was mostly the same as for non-pregnant adults, with no specific need to change delivery plans just because of the infection itself.
So looking back at this whole multi-system picture drawn from these early clinical observations, what were the big unanswered questions at the time, according to the source?
Oh, loads. A key one was, how exactly does the virus spread from the lungs to all these other tissues? Is it viremia virus in the blood? Does the amount of virus matter? And what's the precise interplay between direct viral damage, that endothelial injury and clotting, the immune overreaction, and the RAAS system disruption, which is dominant when...
Understanding the how and why better.
Right. And crucially, what are the long-term consequences of all this multi-organ damage? That was a huge looming question. Plus, optimizing treatments, how best to target inflammation, clotting, the virus, especially when multiple systems are failing. And tons of organ-specific questions remain too.
So a massive amount still to learn, even with all that early data.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive really drives home just how incredibly complex COVID-19 was right from the start. It wasn't just a lung disease, it was hitting practically every system in the body in ways that were often interconnected, but also really surprising.
It really does, and it underscores the immense challenge doctors were facing. They were seeing patients with lung failure, kidney failure, heart problems, weird clotting, confusion, sometimes all at once. The source really highlights how that vascular damage, the endothelial injury and clotting, emerged as a central theme, linking many of these disparate organ problems.
It definitely makes you appreciate how integrated our bodies are. You hit one part, like the vascular system or the immune response, and the effects just ripple outwards everywhere.
Absolutely, and it raises fundamental questions about how we understand and prepare for severe viral illnesses that have this potential for such widespread multi-system impact. So, thinking about this for you, the listener, maybe the takeaway is that symptoms that seem unrelated, maybe skin changes plus fatigue plus digestive issues, could, in the context of an infection like this, actually be part of a single systemic process. It highlights the need to think holistically.
And maybe it leaves us with a bigger question to ponder. We saw how this one virus, SARS-CoV-2, could wreak havoc across so many different interconnected body systems. Thinking about that widespread impact, does this tell us something fundamental about severe viral infections in general? Is this multi-organ picture something relatively unique to COVID-19, or is it perhaps a pattern we should expect, or at least be prepared for, with other novel, highly virulent pathogens that might emerge in the future?
That's definitely something to think about. Is this a one-off or a blueprint for future challenges?
Okay.
That concludes another deep dive.